A very good morning to everyone. I'm Vaish from the Culture Academy and I will be your MC for today's webinar. Welcome to Culture Academy's In Conversation With series. We have about 150 attendees today. Our In Conversation With series offers an open platform for the arts and culture sector, leaders, professionals, and administrators to come together to present or share any aspect of their work and insights. This allows more interesting discussions and cross-pollination of ideas and sharing of best practices on issues that matter to the arts and culture sector. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Audrey Yue, Head Department of Communications and New Media, National University of Singapore, Ms. Yvonne Tang, Chief Executive Officer, The Esplanade Company Limited, and Ms. Shubhigi Rao, Artist, Writer, and Curator for 2022 Kochi Muziris Biennale, who will be sharing their views and insights on the topic of nurturing a sense of us, the role of arts and heritage. This session will be moderated by Mr. Paul Tan. Once again, please feel free to post your questions under the Q&A function anytime, and our speakers will be able to address them during the Q&A session. Without further ado, I will now hand the time over to our moderator, Mr. Paul Tan, to introduce the webinar and the speakers. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Vaish. Hi, and a very good morning, everyone. Good to see a good turnout of over 100 people here virtually. Hopefully, the next session we can do this live in person. There's nothing that can beat, an in-person live discussion. But of course, this is also convenient. It means that all of you can do this from the comfort of your office or your home. Well, first and foremost, welcome to a very special In Conversation session brought to you by the Culture Academy. And we're going to look at the connections, the very deep connections between art, heritage, and culture, as well as a sense of identity. So I'm the moderator. As Vaish just mentioned, my name is Paul. And of course, I'm really delighted and privileged to have the opportunity to see all of you here and also to hear from our panelists and to then, of course, take us through the question and answer session later. I'm sure it's going to be a very lively discussion. I think there are many interesting ideas to explore. For example, arts and heritage as a kind of as an authentic manifestation of life lived by a group of people. But also the idea of a nation as an entity in the modern world, which also has resources to shape culture and to shape identity. And of course, there's the question of COVID, which of course was addressed in the write-up, this seemingly interminable pandemic. What role can the arts and heritage play, to heal the disrupted psyches, to build bridges across different communities? Or, to be a bit provocative, is that too much to expect from culture? Well, with us today, we have a panel of 3 wise women who will help us navigate these tough issues. I will introduce them before they speak. Each one will get 10 minutes. I will be merciless as a timekeeper, and they will keep to the time, I'm sure. And then I will pose some questions to hear our panel's views before opening to the floor for question and answer. Of course, there's a Q&A function there, as well as a raise hand function. And I hope that, audience members will actively participate, preferably raising hands and, so that we can see you as well. Maybe first I just make a few broad comments to hopefully set the stage for the discussion. I would like to share with everyone perhaps the well-known formulation. Some of you may be familiar, the well-known formulation of nation by a very well-respected anthropologist called Benedict Anderson. Well, he basically frames the nation as imagined communities. I think this is a very compelling way of thinking about nation. Basically, he says, I'm going to roughly paraphrase, that a nation is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet, in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Right? The nation, according to Anderson, is also imagined as limited, meaning that beyond the finite boundaries lie other nations with other identities. Right? The nation is also imagined as sovereign. It is free. Right? It is able to exercise some sense of collective will with some sense of autonomy, as opposed to being divinely ordained. And finally, the nation is imagined as a community. So regardless how a nation is structured or stratified, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. So I thought that was a very useful way of thinking about nation. But we all can agree that a nation is a man-made construct. It is not inevitable, it's not fixed in any real sense. But, and this is the big but here, right? I think we also have to acknowledge that belonging to the state is a contemporary reality. Practically all humans today around the world are born into a state, which is of course run by a government, right? Whether the government governs well or not, that's another consideration, right? So I think it's quite useful then to use the words of perhaps something closer to home and a Singapore politician who of course is very well known as the politician who was a great wordsmith. And he said, being Singaporean is a matter not of ancestry, but is a choice and conviction. And of course, the person behind these words is Mr. S. Rajaratnam, the former DPM, and of course the man behind our national pledge. He said this in 1990. And I think the idea of choice and conviction still, bears great relevance today. For the late Mr. Rajaratnam, to choose to be Singaporean was in some ways to accept and to accept that shared imagination. You're part of that shared imagination. And of course, it's of note that he was Singapore's first culture minister. Right? So for him, that culture, the ability to build that shared imagination was existential, right? And I'll finish with one more quote from Mr. Rajaratnam. So, in addressing to his fellow Singaporeans, if you think of yourself as Chinese, Malays, Indians, or Sri Lankans, then Singapore will collapse. You must think of Singapore, this is my country, right? So I offer you two views. I think they complement each other. One, a more academic anthropological view, and of course the reality as it is lived, and words from one of our founding politicians, right? So with that, I hope to have a lively discussion. I'm going to invite each speaker. I will just read a short bio because you can get the full bio online, just to give you a sense of who we're hearing from. We will go in this sequence. We'll start with Professor Audrey Yue, and then we'll go to Yvonne, and then we'll end with Shubigi. So I will first like to ask Audrey to stand by, and I will introduce her. She is the professor and head of the Department of Communications and New Media at the NUS. And Audrey has published more than 8 scholarly books and over 110 articles, chapters, and commission reports. And I'm sure she's got a lot more to add as she completes the research on COVID-19 on the arts, something which I also contributed a small part to, right? So without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor over to Professor Audrey Yue, and look forward to listening to her. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and everyone for inviting me here to talk on the theme of national identity and culture. So in the next 10 minutes, I want to address 2 questions that have been asked by the organizers for us to discuss. My area of expertise is on cultural policy, digital media art, and urban communication. So I want to draw from some of these examples. So the first question is, how have the arts, culture, and heritage, ACH, the acronym, I'll be using that acronym throughout my talk, brought societies and communities together and instill a sense of rootedness, national identity, and pride in our people. As Paul has introduced, nations are imagined communities. They are constructed through shared languages, traditions, cultures, and rituals. So they create common characteristics that bind us together as a people living together within a shared territory. And in that shared territory, the shared imagination create national sentiment, primordial feelings about belonging to the land and territory, and collective solidarity that allow us to identify with one another internally and create distinctions that separate us from others externally, right? So when Anderson wrote the book Imagined Communities, the one that Paul was referring to, Anderson was really talking about legacy media, the newspaper in particular, as a mechanism that can do that. That was because people felt a sense of belonging because they read the newspaper and they had shared information that came from from the newspaper. So in the newspaper at that time was like a national technology. It created this imagination that was able to suture the individuals within the nation and the divides that form the nation together, right? But now we're in a kind of post, kind of analog polymedia age. Newspapers no longer have that sort of function. But what I want to say, the second point, is that the ACH have the potential to play the role previously assumed by the newspaper. This is especially so because Singapore's ACH sector is heavily subsidized by the government. In fact, the most subsidized in Southeast Asia and in the Asia Pacific world. There are more opportunities to shape and reshape the making of culture. Secondly, there's a diversity of platforms. When you look at the ACH, it's narrow, traditional arts, performing arts, visual arts, but also broad, creative culture industry, new media art, everyday life and popular culture, food, heritage, pop music, and so on and so forth. So the diversity of the sector means that there's many avenues to communicate. And thirdly, right, arts and culture are symbolic forms. That means they are expressive medium for representation. They create meaning and they're very powerful tools of communication. So they play two functions, right? The first one is they maintain our national identity, and they do that through storytelling. And they continue to transmit foundational stories with each telling and retelling. And with each iteration, they sustain who we are as a nation and as a people. And you can see that with the bicentennial experience at Fort Canning in 2019, 700 years of Singapore's history, completely repackaged with multimedia, spectacular show, right? Very successful, 760 people attended and 95% are Singaporeans. So I'm sure you can think of many examples of storytelling, okay, to maintain identity. But more so, it does so via what communication scholar James Carey called the ritual model of communication. So here, communication is not just transmitting messages, right? Communication is a process by which a culture is created, is shared, is modified and transformed. So here, the ritual model of communication means communication is directed towards maintaining society, is about the creation, representation, and celebration of shared beliefs. Like the ritual is almost like a sacred ceremony. It draws people in fellowship and commonality, and it can serve the function of affirming or creating cultural identity amongst a community of speakers. So on the slide here, you see the Light Tonight Festival. I studied these sorts of light projection for a long time. This is the COVID iteration. It was very different the last 2 years. People sat together, the padang was open, the family, children, couples, they brought their picnic mats and enjoying the ambience of participation, almost, and you can't talk, right, because of social distancing and the mask. So very ritualistic, if you like, okay. And this idea of ritual of communication, the ritual of storytelling, it evokes feelings of sharing, participation, association, and fellowship. And if you think about the root term of communication, it actually comes from communion, community, commonness, right? And common space is a term that our government use all the time. So the ACH, through ritual storytelling, they not only repeat foundational stories, but they allow us to create community. So maintaining identity, that's my first point, right? The second point is ritual storytelling to negotiate identity because of new migrants, because of globalization, or to represent, vulnerable groups. And this is important to foster internal cohesion. And historically, I think the ACH and policy have been very successful in doing that, with sustaining diversity through multiculturalism and multicultural arts, also increasingly representing new vulnerable groups or marginal groups through disability arts, arts for seniors. So here, for example, you see a 2012 projection in Punggol Waterway by the duo Brendan Thier and Safwan Johari, and they were commissioned by the People's Association at that time. This was one of the earliest projections that you saw in Singapore. And the neighborhood first opened, people moved in the neighborhood, nobody knew one another. So the People's Association commissioned them to say, let's have a festival, a 5-hour music event, a projection onto the flats, and all the neighbors came down and all the kids drew little pictures, and then it was projected onto the wall, right? So Safwan Johari said, it was like a typical CC event. You had your grandparents, kids and all that. And the first time it was pinned on the wall, everybody was like, wow, what's that? You know, even though we know HDB flats, we grew up in them, but the lights, you know, show the materiality and the beauty of the flats in a different way, right? So we see here the ritual of communion and celebration in a new neighborhood of fellow citizens and strangers. So two takeaways from my first point, right? How does it do that to bring the nation together? Ritual storytelling, okay, to maintain existing identity and to negotiate new and emergent identity. And then the second question, what is the role of ACH, okay, in our post-COVID pandemic, endemic world, and how can we use ACH, you know, to foster solidarity in a VUCA world, right? So let me talk about the role of ACH in our three future economies to see how it can bring back solidarity, cohesion, care, and confidence. The first one is the digital economy. The pandemic saw the evolution of the sector. It democratized production, increased digital audience online. And some artists, they pivoted well. Some art cannot pivot, some artists cannot pivot, but you know, others pivoted well. And the government Arts and Culture Resilience Package, 75,000, was really useful to provide education and training for artists to need to pivot. But what we're seeing is a new kind of aesthetics, mixed media with, you know, virtual reality, immersive, you know, kind of media coming up, and they're here to stay. So we have then, you know, a kind of increased audience, foster kind of connection. The new aesthetics help us to brand the new kind of Singapore identity moving forward. And there's also increased employment. A lot of people took up new jobs in this kind of digital arts and culture space. So what we need to do going forward is to continue to nurture creative, digital creativity, nurture enterprise and markets in this particular realm, right? And then the second economy is the green economy. And, you know, when we think about, you know, climate change and sustainability, we don't really think about culture, but it's really important to think of culture as the fourth pillar of sustainability, right? We always think about three pillars. Environment means planet, right? Economic means viability, right? And social means what about the people? But we forget about culture. You know, culture is a resource, is our cultural wealth, and we need to protect that so that we can pass cultural wealth and resource from one generation to the next. So intergenerational, you know, continuity, intergenerational cultural resource and intercultural, you know, kind of justice, right? We can maintain all that. Here, we need to continue to protect heritage, but we need to allocate equitable access to resources and inclusive access to such resources. And arts making in this context also needs to be sustainable. Livelihood for artists, for freelancers. Pandemic saw the precarity of cultural jobs. We need to better protect jobs, recognize jobs, pay artists better. Organizations exist on very low profit margin. A lot of the heritage businesses have closed, right? We need to better support that. We need to better policies to support and nurture entrepreneurship models, you know, that can allow artists and constituencies and organizations to fulfill both environmental, economic, and social agenda, right? And then finally, care economy. Okay, VUCA world, we're so burnt out, society is so polarized. We know arts is so useful for internal social cohesion. Art is so useful for health and well-being. Here, I think we need to nurture new kinds of art form. Okay, participatory, socially engaged action art, collaborative art between community, organization, and artists all coming together. We need to continue to represent diversity, to give, you know, visibility to vulnerable groups so we can represent them. And we need to continue to advocate for arts education because it's about cultural literacy, you know, at all levels. When people are culturally literate, you know, they are able then to use arts as a tool to help us navigate this complicated world that we live in. So 0 seconds now. And my last slide, takeaway for the question 2, you know, the ACH is foundational to our future economy, right? If we can do all that, we will become a stronger and more progressive nation. So, okay, thanks, Paul.
Thanks. Thanks, Audrey. Yeah, sorry to have to make you kind of like do a bit of quick whistle stop, over the last few minutes, yeah, as you had to accelerate a little. I thank you very much for your presentation. I thought it was a great overview of what arts and culture and heritage can do in today's world. I was particularly struck by your suggestion that the arts and heritage can play a role that was actually previously played by mainstream newspapers, right? And also a good reminder about the power of storytelling, that stories can maintain a culture, but also stories can evolve, they're not static. That to me was a particularly good takeaway. And of course, Audrey also reminded us that the arts and heritage can play a role in the economy of today and tomorrow, right? And she framed it as digital economy, talking about some of the potential of going online, but also some of the challenges, the evolution of a new aesthetics, and also on the green and the care economies. So I think that gives us a good foundation to understanding some of the possibilities. I think next we will then hear from the perspective of someone who, from the perspective of a performing arts center. So we're going to invite Yvonne Tam to share with us what today's topic, developing a sense of us, means from the lens of someone who runs Singapore's premier and foremost performing arts center. Yvonne is the chief exec of the Esplanade Company, and she's responsible for the overall management and programming direction of the Esplanade. And of course, aside from their excellent inclusive all-year programs, which I'm sure everyone in this virtual room has attended one way or another, I think one of the highlights Singaporeans can expect this year, and I'm certainly looking forward to this, is the new Waterfront Theatre, which will open, I think, in a couple of months' time and will sit over 500 packs. So that's something to look forward to, and I'm sure there'll be many interesting shows there. And I'm sure Yvonne will touch on those as well as all the other interesting things that are happening at the Esplanade. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. Paul started with talking about emerging communities, and Audrey gave us a sense of what the arts and culture can do. I'm going to share from Esplanede's perspective and in a way, bring us kind of fairly down to earth in terms of a space, a set space that government has kind of allocated for us to build an art center, and to show some of the stories and that has informed how the space has evolved. And I think the sense of community is at the heart of what we do at Esplanade. If you think of community as a group of people in a shared space over time, a fairly iterative process, Esplanade is a shared space. Because it's an institution, we know it's going to be protected as a space for the arts over time. The question that Esplanade had to really answer was, who are the people who are going to make this space express their sense of community, or can this space help form or support a sense of community amongst people? Who's the people? What's going to bring people together? Why? For what reason? And I think that when Esplanade was first formed, it was controversial, right? Because local artists were saying, this is not a space for me. We wanted the mid-size, we wanted smaller studios. Government decided to build a big theatre and a big concert hall. There was a fear or concern that local audiences are also going to say, it's not a space for me. At that point, we had one arts festival a year, and we have the orchestras with the regular calendar. But then the question was, who's the audience? Where's the audience going to come from? So I think those were the things that really informed the initial management team of the Esplanade. They wanted to challenge themselves with it. They didn't want to challenge themselves. They were challenged by the fact that people were saying to them, I don't want you. I don't think you're going to be relevant to me. And you know what? I think you're going to fail. So I think those were the things, the issues that the management team faced. And I think very quickly, they went back to the fundamentals of then, who are the communities in Singapore that Esplanade is serving? How do we build that sense of community in this space? And because we are a space, I think the team very, very wisely went into shared and public spaces. We looked at the concourse, they looked at the beautiful waterfront, they looked at the rooftop, the common spaces that people would kind of just go by, walk through. And they said, if these were the common spaces, you didn't need a ticket to get in, you didn't need to feel like you had to dress up for it. then how do we put the arts in these spaces? I think one of the most important decisions that was made was to put the arts in the concourse, build a concourse stage there. The steps that were, if you come in the main entrance of the Esplanade, the first thing you'll be greeted by is an art installation. If you walk by the waterfront, there is an outdoor theater, and like moths being attracted to light, right? On the weekend, the sound and the music just draws people to that space. So all the decisions in those initial years was actually to say, let's return the space, public spaces, to the arts, not lock the arts away in our theater or in the concert hall, but really take it out into the open public space. And that kind of thinking went into even how restaurants were curated. We constantly then ask ourselves, if Esplanade was a space for everybody, then it needed to have food options that then could serve everyone. So if you ask some of the team members in Esplanade, sometimes we look at and go, okay, we've got a price point gap here. Somebody who comes in with less than $10 in your pocket, where would they eat? Someone who wants something a bit fancier, where would they eat? So we think about every single aspect of this center from the perspective of, can it serve that broad range of communities, and is it accessible? Will people feel they belong when they come into the Esplanade? And then that further informs another layer of thinking, which is there going to be a dress code? And the very simple answer is no. You can wear and you can be yourself in this space. Will we have rules about how long people can sit in the public spaces? Will you demarcate spaces where people can't hang out? And again, the simple answer is no. So the thinking behind how we manage an art center is then, can anyone walk through, always encounter some form of the arts in the public space, feel comfortable, feel welcome, and not feel like it's not for me, which was the issue that faced the Esplanade when it first opened. The third thing that it had to do beyond opening up the public spaces, thinking about all the rules in a way that govern how those public spaces are run, is then the programming. And I think one of the first things that we did was to say, you know what, there are communities out there. We're not inventing this. And so it's then about bringing those communities into the art center. And the question was then asked, when do communities gather? And a very simple answer was when we celebrate something. We celebrate a wedding, when we celebrate certain points of New Year's, for instance. And a decision was then made, let's start cultural festivals at each point when various communities in Singapore would be celebrating food, culture, coming together. So we started 3 cultural festivals right from the very start. Hua Yi, a Chinese cultural festival at the time of the Chinese New Year, Kala Utsavam during Deepavali, and Pesta Raya during the Hari Raya month. So it was to then say, if as a community you're celebrating all these aspects of who you are, the arts wants to be part of that conversation and that celebration. In some ways, it already is, right? We sing and dance when we celebrate. And those festivals were a way then to bring communities into the art center as they celebrate. And as you think about it, festivals are a way to do that, bring different communities into the art center. Another very early festival was Babies, and you have metalheads at the art center. Again, challenging the idea that the arts is classical, it's somewhat atas, it's separate from us. So the third strategy was then constantly bringing existing communities in. And the fourth thing I want to just raise is actually what's unique about the arts is that for the 2 hours that you're seated in the audience, you are, for that strange, experience that you have, itself a community. For 2 hours, even if you're watching something terribly difficult and you wish you were there, you're wondering why you're there, the very fact that you're struggling to understand and this room full of 200 people, you are, despite all your differences, your different backgrounds, somewhat for that time, a community. I think this is something quite special about theatre and the arts, to be able to put very difficult issues in that same space with audiences who are actually very diverse and actually present those issues to them. And I think that's the fourth thing that I want to to kind of put forward on the role of the arts, the ability to bring divergent views, placing it in the same space, not necessarily saying that we have to walk away with the same understanding. It's a kind of like Walt Whitman's famous line, right? I am large, I contain multitudes. That's why artistic expressions always appeal. I'm just going to end with 2 points. What I've shared is kind of the foundation of how an art center, I think, tries to build a sense of community. But I think going forward, there are 2 things that I just thought to raise. With the increasing kind of fractured world, as what Paul is saying, and after 2 years when we don't see what's happening in the rest of the world, I think the role of the Art Center in bringing in international works is no longer just about that moment of consumption, if you will. I can't fly to London or New York to watch this. I get to see it in our home country. I think it's even more critical in today's context that art centers see themselves as centers of exchange, as centers of actually bridging understanding of very, very different cultures, to see things that you will not experience normally, that you choose not to experience. And even as you walk into the space, to hear a sound that may be alien to you. And in some ways, that's what Esme also tries to do. You may come for a classical music concert, you walk out, and in the concourse, that could be Indian music. That you are constantly confronted by things that are new to you, and to then bring that into your sense of, is this what I'm familiar with? Is this what I want to know more about? So 2 points I want to end with. One is, in this fractured world, the role of the art centers in bringing divergent and very different global cultures together. I think we still must endeavor to do that. And the second is the idea of digital space, which is a kind of amorphous space. And actually, if you think about it, very transient. So unlike an institution over time, what happens when you're in this space that you cannot see and touch for very transient time? How then does a sense of community come out of it? In the arts or culture, we tend to think of digital space as a platform, as a channel, as a tool, or even as a repository. I don't think we've really thought about digital space as something for a community. And I think that's why the digital space continues to be a very fractured space, that you will get people gathering around very specific interests, listening to that very one view that they all hold. So then what then is the role of the arts if our power is actually bringing different people together, challenging them constantly with divergent views, and in a way showing that, it is accessible, it is diverse. How do artists and art centers and cultural institutions then think about and inhabit and influence the digital space beyond it being a platform, a tool, or a repository? And I don't have an answer to that. That's where I'm, in a way, Esplanade as an art center, that's where we are at the moment as well. So I'll just thank you so much for listening for the last 10 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Yvonne. Yeah. I really appreciated your recap on some of the history that Esplanade has had in the last 20 odd years, right? Especially the initial concerns when Esplanade first came up, and the concerns that the management had, and the sense of anxiety about how the community, the artistic community, as well as the audiences, were going to take to this new art center. So I appreciate the very candid sharing, and also importantly, how with deep thinking and very deliberate, conscientious kind of programming, curation of spaces, Esplanade has become the inclusive, warm, fuzzy art center that everyone loves today. But at the same time, being a space that can have different views, right, and contain multitudes, as you say, to borrow from Walt Whitman, right? And the kind of multitudes include divergences, different points of views, and how that shared experience of being together in the art center, is really powerful, even if you don't necessarily all leave the space, with a converged point of view, that we can contain those multitudes. I think that's a very powerful idea, especially today when a lot of discourse around the world, can be in echo chambers, right? And that's something I think all of us are quite aware of and quite sensitized to. Our third and final panelist is also someone that needs barely any introduction. So I will ask you to go look at the longer bio if you want to find out more about Ms. Shubigi Rao. And of course, Shubigi is currently representing Singapore at the Pavilion in Venice. So she's our Singapore artist in Venice and the curator for the Kochi Biennale this year as well. So she wears both an artist hat as well as a curator's hat. In 2020, her book Pulp, a short biography of the Banished Book, which is all about the history of book destruction and the future of knowledge, won the Singapore Literature Prize for Nonfiction. So she also wears a hat as a writer. So she wears multiple hats, and of course, as a creative practitioner, would have, of course, valuable insights to share on today's theme as well. So I'm going to pass over to Shubigi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Slightly embarrassing introduction, but thank you. I think it's sometimes interesting how when you do this, I'm always reminded of how detached one is from these ideas of self, and that actually is sort of what we're really discussing, right? Multiple ideas of self and how they contribute in these communities. And I think that I'm so glad you led with Benedict Anderson, because the idea of imagined communities is something I think we should actually have as text taught in a mandatory way, perhaps. I think that there are two main things I really want to talk about. And these two things come from my roles, if I may say, as you mentioned, artist, writer, curator, and all of that, but also because I've been an arts educator as well for many years. I taught for 11 years at LaSalle and also at NIA and Poly and places like that. But the reason I mentioned that is because it was always in a freelancer type of role, like in an adjunct role. And this speaks to a certain precarity that is also involved in most arts practices in Singapore, and of course also in other places across the world. But for the subject of just for today, I think I'll just concentrate on the local context. We've spoken about a number of things. We always highlight this. I really enjoyed the earlier panelist presentations because they addressed two major things. Professor Audrey, you also talked about sustainability, which is something we hear a lot about when we talk about or listen to talks about the arts. And it also comes to the point that I want to talk about, which is about anxiety. There's anxiety not only in the way artists feel that they can produce and survive in the economy, not just locally, but even participate globally. But there's also anxiety in the way, that institutions, I think, in Singapore have to constantly prove that the arts have a role. I would argue that you don't need to do that. As you know, there was an infamous poll that came out in the Straits Times about essential workers during the first lockdown, and arts were the most non-essential. And the people who voted for that were people who also, all of us were at the same time consuming massive amounts of creative content just to keep ourselves going through the isolation of lockdown, right? So it's so amazing how people have de-linked their consumption patterns and what it is they partake in as the arts. So this idea was I think emphasized the fact that the choice of graphic was a mustachioed man with a beret and a paintbrush, and that could not be further from the reality of being an artist. I know that I'm not going to get into the whole furore about that, post that, but it points to a general disconnect, right, between what constitutes the arts and why we have so much anxiety about constantly having to justify the need for arts in culture in our nation state. I think that this was brilliantly addressed, I think, in the first presentation as well, but I really like what Yvonne said as well. When she's at the end, when she talked about how an arts center actually brings in divergent forms of thinking, which is really healthy. And I couldn't agree more. One of the reasons why I've been able to wear so many hats, as you say, and it's not just me, but also for other artists and / other things, is because a kind of fluidity between practice, medium, and also ways of being, ways of thinking that's the most creative act you can do as a human being. I think that we tend to calcify and stagnate the older we go if we don't consciously guard against this, right? So I think that rigid forms of identity or thinking about identity in rigid ways that only hearken to traditional markers of identity are very damaging. And these are strong words to use, but I can get away with it because I'm the non-institutional person here. So I think that it's very important that we recognize that change, divergence is not a threat. It's not something that the average person needs to be afraid of, because it tends to be a pushback against things that are counter to that. So for instance, a lot of our if you look at cultural tradition, for instance, what we regard as almost sacred cultural tradition or cultural practices that are traditional were not traditional at the time they were made. Tradition really should be way more than peer pressure from dead people. I think tradition is something that's constantly evolving and having a dialogue with the present, right? This point has been made really well earlier, so I won't belabor it, but I have to say that should allay some of the anxiety about the ways in which we try to constantly box or categorize or label forms of artistic production. This is very counterintuitive to having a genuinely diverse and genuinely sustainable scene. One of the reasons why I wear so many hats personally is because when you cannot be clearly defined, people are less likely to legislate you or control or constantly sort of say, oh, okay, this is a visual arts exhibition. How can you have books in here? Who's to say books are not visual triggers for visual imagination? They are. The hallucinating we do when we read is the most visual experience we can have. So my argument is always that you cannot separate art forms from each other. You should not be separating institutional and non-institutional ways of thinking. It needs more porosity, and more transnational thinking actually is very useful. And I can give you a very concrete example of this, One of the biggest jumps that occurred for me, or one of the biggest boosts to my practice and my way of thinking, was doing a residency not overseas. And I've done a number of residencies overseas, as you know, supported by National Arts Council, including the prestigious Kunstlaus-Bethanien one in Berlin. But the one that turned out to be the most valuable was the first residency I ever did, and that was in Singapore while I was living here. And that was with NTU CCA's studio residency program. And the reason it was useful is because you were not isolated in your own studios. There was communal space to hang out. And so I was introduced to not just other local practitioners and thinkers, artists, curators, etc., but also Southeast Asian thought. And this was so important because as Singaporeans, we tend to look west to the global, what's known as the global north now, rather than looking at our neighbors. So if we're talking about traditional cultural practices, we cannot think of them in the void of the nation state only. That's one point. My final point is actually really, really quick. I think that I wanted to go back really to mentioning this idea about shared identities. I think it's more important for us to recognize that identities are incredibly fluid. I think that to imagine not just the identity as in an individual level, but also at the level of community, is to actually imagine something without borders. So I wouldn't like us to constantly bookend or label or categorize simply for the purpose of paperwork, funding, and so on. I know that's necessary in an institutional and bureaucratic level, but that has now begun to permeate almost completely and saturate ways of thinking here. And I'm saying this now as an arts educator. It can be a bit dispiriting sometimes when you see young nascent artists or art students worrying more about how their work will be either picked up by a gallery at an art fair, which is again not a sustainable thing, or how if they're eligible for certain types of support or sponsorship. So we've begun to see this pattern where young people categorize themselves beforehand so that they are now eligible. And we saw this with the emphasis on support for digital forms of production during the COVID-19 lockdown, especially in 2020, 2021. I think that shut out people of a certain age. It was, I think, a little bit ageist. It was also not possible for people who were versed in that technology to be able to partake in that. So it actually increased a sense of precarity. So the argument I'm trying to make is that in the quest to be inclusive, in the quest to have new as well, it's very important to understand that not that one size fits all will never work. And it's very important to actually have spaces that are organically either managed or occur through collaboration and are not just isolationist rooms. Like I said, for me, I come back to the studio experience. It worked because we weren't only in separate rooms. There was communal space, there was space to hang out, there was space to talk, collaborate, and actually become interdisciplinary, not only in your practice, but in your ways of thinking. I think when we talk about the role of the arts in the ecosystem of Singapore, especially, I don't think we need to have so much anxiety about sustainability. We have, I think, per capita, way more arts production than most nation states, right? Yet there's such a gap in perception. We think that we have to constantly force feed the average Singaporean, like, look, the arts are important, the arts are important. We don't need to do this. If you really want the arts to be embedded, start really young. Creative thinking exists naturally in preschool and primary school kids, but our schooling system doesn't always support that. For instance, primary schools have barely an hour of arts instruction a week. Let's start there. Let's start with also just realizing that sometimes less intrusive methods of teaching might be helpful, less rigid forms of teaching might be helpful, and allow people to actually formulate their own forms of expression creatively from a young age. And you'll see how people naturally, they see the arts as a natural form of not only expression, but also a way of living every day. So I'll end here. I have a lot more to say, but I think this is really the gist of it. It's really these two major points. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Subigi. Yeah, it looks like your fears about overrunning were misplaced. You see, you kept your time. Yeah.
Because I went last.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought your comments were very instructive, and my two takeaways are the words porosity and fluidity. I think the porosity and fluidity applies to the way identities are kind of shaped, or the way we perceive identities, and even that importance of being fluid, applies to art forms, to cultural traditions, to even the sense of nations, right? I think you made a pitch for a transnational kind of discourse and engagement, and I also take to the point that you made about how one size doesn't fit all when it comes to supporting the arts. Certainly you don't want young artists to box themselves in, based on the kind of support that is available. Box themselves so early and to kind of limit their own possibilities for growth. So I think some really powerful ideas there, and I'm sure there will be more of such thoughts from you as we move to the Q&A section. So I welcome back Yvonne and Audrey to our friendly discussion. At this point, I invite audiences to also put in their Q&A first in the box, and then subsequently, when I open it to the floor, you can also raise your hands as well. I know we've got two questions from Eugene. Hi, Eugene. We'll try to get to those. Yeah. We have some already existing questions that had come in earlier today, and I will also wield my prerogative as the moderator to get the discussion going, if that's all right with everyone. One of the questions that came in just asked, how can we build common sense with local global tension, right? But if I can put an overlay, my own overlay to that question, which had earlier come in from an education institution, hopefully the person who put the question is here, is to think a bit about perhaps what Subigi said about transnational, and also from an artist or curator's perspective, being able to think borderlessly is of course a very powerful idea, to be able to form partnerships with overseas institutions or artists, or even just to think about identity in a more fluid manner. I think that impulse is understood, but how do you kind of navigate that while recognizing that the country itself as an imagined entity, but no doubt a shared imagined entity, would also want to develop a sense of roots, right? Given the kind of forces that can pull, from all over the world, the different type of competing narratives, that it is very understandably in the nation's interest to then think about what are the things that it wants to do to help the people develop, a sense of rootedness in the place that they live, and a sense of citizenship in the country that they're born into, or have pledged allegiance to, or have come into, right? So a very broad open question. Any of our three panelists want to get us going? Yes, please. Yeah. Maybe I invite Audrey, if you have immediate thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks everyone for wonderful presentation. So Paul's question was, how can we build a common sense with local and global, and how can the country in a world of globalization continue to build a sense of roots, right? So I want to come back to address the issue of transnationalism that Shubhiki kind of talked about, but also to bring up this idea of cosmopolitanism, because we always seem to think, oh, Singapore is now so global, so transnational, what are we going to do? But, like as if it's a new thing, but I think we need to think of transnationalism as inherently a part of the founding of Singapore, and as inherently a part of the prehistory of Singapore as well, as a space of, as a country of old migrants and new migrants all coming together, and in a contemporary current moment, an open society will always be open to external cultural flows, right? So when we think of transnationalism in this way, I want to talk about the idea of cosmopolitanism. It's we'd say, okay, if the country is transnational, that means it's cosmopolitan, okay? And in fact, the word cosmopolitan is also used by SM Go many years ago to talk about outward-looking and mobile Singaporeans, right? And when we think of the arts, especially high art, professional artists, they're very mobile. They've always aspired to be international and global. But, to come back to think about what cosmopolitan actually is actually about being a citizen of the world, to embody a sense of worldliness, right? To identify with a universal, but there is still a local at play, okay? So that's the classic sense of cosmopolitanism. So hold on to that for a while. But when we think of cosmopolitanism, we always think of it in a colloquial sense, global culture, right? So trendy, savvy, colorful, with so much pizzazz, so spectacular. Everywhere in the world, it's all the same, and it's very seductive for artists, for consumers, for producers, because you can build cultural capital like that. But I think we need to slow down on that, because that to me is universal monocultural, okay? It's not a universal that links the local with the national, okay? So how do we bridge the two together, the local, the national, and the global? So if we think of, cosmopolitanism, it's not just aesthetics. Aesthetics is also not just, at surface level, right? And it's also not really about politics, demanding kind of social justice. I want to bring in the idea of we need an ethics, okay? Ethics, in a broad way, it's not about laws or codes, it's about respect, okay? So in a cosmopolitan world of transnationalism, how do we interact with difference, from local, national, and global? How do we recognize the otherness and the humanity of the other? How do we respect others? Okay, that's kind of what we need to think about when we think about this world of porosity, of transnationalism, and the negotiating of local and global. So we need to think of these shifts in terms of, cultural and identity formations, right? Not just art forms, not just identity, but how these are shifting. Local, national, ethnic is shifting into hybrid, flexible, and polyvalent, right? But we need to think, of kind of like a transnationalism, if you like, or cosmopolitanism as a way for the local, the provincial, the national to come together so that we can confront all these new challenges that are brought on by, porous borders, okay, that are brought on by globalization. So in order to be transnational and global and universal, or whatever you want to call it, we need a local identity. The local identity is the precondition, but this local identity has to be shaped by specific ideals of the nation, the self, the family, or whatever determinants you want to shape local identity, and how that local identity then will encounter, the promise of the world, the promise of globalization, of mobility, right? So I think that's a very long way to kind of answer the kind of question about transnationalism and porosity. Hope that makes sense.
And thanks, Audrey. Yes, I think it does. I think thanks for sketching some of the complex dynamics between all the different forces at play, right? Local, provincial, global. But it is possible to have your cake and eat it. I think that's what you're saying. It is possible to have your cake and eat it. Yvonne, you're smiling. Yeah. Can we have our cake and eat it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Audrey and trying to see how those things are lived out at the Esplanade. If indeed we can live those things, those values, or that ideal out, right? and try to think of what are some of the examples. And, what Audrey said about the local and international, that you having to be confident or comfortable with your own skin before you can comfortably acknowledge and embrace somebody else's kind of dignity, if you will. Yeah. Just thinking of work like Tuesdays with Maurice, which happened at Hawaii Festival. Very popular work, done in Mandarin by a Taiwanese group, presented in Singapore. You think about all that, how that one story has gone through so many rounds, right? It's been translated, it's reinterpreted by two actors in Taiwan, brought back to Singapore in the context of the Chinese Cultural Festival. And then what is ultimately shared is still common humanity. Me, my body, facing death. I mean, if you think of it, and that actually is the power of the arts. Or I think of a festival at Esplanade, such as Tapestry, which is a festival of sacred music. And of course, we would have performers from Singapore, but you would have a Tibetan Buddhist ritual right next to perhaps a Teochew temple ritual, and that happens back to back. A festival that has been, I think, growing with more and more Singaporeans being open to that experience, I think, of just encountering difference. Of course, when you encounter difference, then you could say, are you exorcising it? And I think we can never run away from that. And in the Art Center, then some of the questions we ask ourselves is, what levels of understanding can we build beyond the spectacle of art? And art often exists only at that level of spectacle.
So there's a lot of work for the programming team then, right? To try.
That's right. Yeah.
Reach out to
And
different types of
in
audience.
a way, I would like to say it's also a matter of time. We often think of the arts as a pop-up event here, a big festival, something that happens and gathers everyone's attention for 2 or 3 days. But actually, the work of programmers, artists, curators should be seen over a period of time, because you're actually trying to shape or contribute to conversations over generations. And if a value is passed on from one to the next, then you've done something. So just punting that out there like that, that's how we encounter or counter the charge of creating spectacles, that actually the nature of the work needs to be assessed over a longer period.
I'm sure Shu Vicky won't disagree with that, right? I think time is absolutely important, and the ability to get the audience to kind of appreciate at one level and then maybe think and reflect a little bit more. I think that takes time. What are your experiences?
Oh, absolutely. Even as you know from my practice, I do everything in 10-year blocks. I think it's to have time with a thought, to be able to take it to its logical conclusion is a luxury, I think, very often when we're constantly overwhelmed by information, but actually unable to sift through it and also contextualize things and to really build our own thoughts and responses rather than reactionary responses. So some of what I say is also because I'm trying to push back against a lot of reactionary responses that come from a place of being overwhelmed but lacking contextual information. And this also speaks to the relationship that certain members of the public sometimes might have. When I say relationship, it's a polite word for the reaction that certain members of the public sometimes have towards the arts. This is not a problem only in Singapore. We can see it unfolding at the current Documenta right now, which is the world's largest visual arts event, right? I'd invite you all to look at the news and see what's been happening, and it's happening in Germany. So this is not a local thing where we have to balance different desires, different needs, different interpretations, and also sensitivities of communities. This is something that we can look at other countries to see how they manage or mismanage things like this. I think that when we speak about common sense, I personally have an aversion to the term common sense, because common sense is really not common, as we know, but also what does it really mean? It doesn't mean that we all subscribe to the same ideals. It's impossible. At any given point, an individual's positions ethics and philosophies shift. These are conditional whether we like to admit them or not. And this is a neuroscientific fact. None of us are static. How can our communities be static? Our identities be static? When I mentioned fluidity, I didn't only mean fluidity of exchange and dialogue, discourse and sharing and collaboration. Yes, yes, all those things. But even within ourselves as singular individuals, if you find yourself hewing to an ideological position, you may find yourself forced to defend it even when it is indefensible. And I'm bringing this up because sometimes the anxiety that comes from how we stage certain forms of art practice in Singapore comes also from this anxiety of, if it's going to be seen by the so-called masses, right? We have to scrutinize it even more. So that form of scrutiny permeates into the way everything from how scripts are written to how staging is done, but you still can't predict what reactions will be. I think instead of managing audience expectations and audience reactions all the time, perhaps look at the work that's actually being done. Yvonne has made some absolutely excellent points that I couldn't agree with more. Thank you for that. I really think that it was important what you mentioned about time, but also the fact that you mentioned that this thing about comfort. It is okay to be uncomfortable in your own skin. I think it is okay. In fact, it is necessary. When we're uncomfortable, we ask questions. When we're too comfortable, we get smug. And that smugness will not buffer us and will not make us resilient. Because we do speak a lot about resilience, right? What is resilience? Resilience comes from encounters that you cannot predict, that you cannot control. And I think the argument I'm constantly trying to make is that it is okay that things don't always work out the way we hoped that they would when we were managing them. And I say this as someone who manages projects, and I say this as someone who's now curating South Asia's largest arts event. Right. So I'm not saying this only as an artist. OK, so I'm not like an artist speaking from the fringes or anything. I do know what it means. I do know what it means to work with all these different things. And I think that what Yvonne has mentioned is important from that point of view. But I really do think we need to not let anxiety be the driver for the way in which we allow certain forms to grow and evolve. Certain things do need time. Let's give them that time. Then missteps happen. Don't penalize straight away. That's one of the things I would say. And I would also mention as a parting shot, and it is a parting shot, we need to get away from a culture of censorship by letter writer. One person writes a letter, and I'm saying this as a parent. I'm really tired of like one person saying, but what about my kids? You know what? Talk to your kids. Like seriously, just talk to your kids. The arts are not there to give your kids the talk that you should be doing. So please stop trying to censor the arts simply because you're not ready for it, or you don't know how to, you don't have the vocabulary for it. Talk to us. We have the vocabulary. We're more than happy to explain why and how, right? That's what we do as artists, as practitioners, as institutions, and so on. So I think we need to move away from a kind of reactionary relationship and a fear-based relationship with the audience.
Thanks, Shubhigi. I think many in the room would agree with you. I think we all need to expand our vocabulary and have a greater sense of confidence. Just a quick shout out for those of you who have never been to Kochi. I've been to the Kochi Biennale, not the one that she curated, but it's really a beautiful city. And during Biennale time, you have really some of the best South Asian artists on display. Right? It's
international also.
Yeah,
sorry.
really
it's
international.
An international
yeah, it is. But I found that, well, at least the edition I went to, the Indian artists were the one that really left the most indelible impression. But yes, it is international. It's a great Biennale, and of course, we're really, I think Singapore should be very proud that Shubhigi is curating this very important platform. But should be to try and kind of make some connections to Audrey's points, right? I mean, Audrey had suggested that it was important to have a sense of ethics, right? As you try and negotiate the transnational world and even your own multiple identities. And also, she had said that the local is a precondition, which I found a very tantalizing idea. Would that be incompatible with what you're saying?
Not really. What I would say as an addendum to that, which I'm sure Audrey herself probably also would have said, I mean, it's sometimes in the interest of time, we use shorthand, right? I think when we use the word ethics, it has to be understood there's not one singular type of ethics. There's no singular philosophical position or ethical position, or I dread to use the word, but moral position that any one of us can claim to have. If you do have a singular ethics, you'll find yourself almost guilty of hypocrisy at times, because it is almost impossible to live up to ethical ideals. I think in the formulation of ethical positions and ethical behavior, I would rather talk about ethical behavior, because that's something that's constantly negotiated with each instance of interaction with fellow human beings, right? Within our community and outside of it as well. So I think that that formulation of ethical behavior and ethical thought occurs the more we're confronted by things that we do not yet understand or are challenged by. So challenges are actually opportunities to test your ethical positions and ideological positions. And I find that for someone like me who is actually quite transnational, that's what's actually kept me from, I think, stagnating intellectually perhaps, but also, sticking to the positions I had as a young person. I'm glad that I outgrew some of those positions. I'm glad that my ethics have evolved and continue to evolve. And I'm glad that I still cannot say very clearly what my ethical positions are, unless I'm called upon to in a given situation. So context matters, situation matters, interaction matters. Just very briefly, I wanted to mention one thing about Kochi since you brought it up. When you go to the Kochi Biennale, it's not like any other, for one reason, that the locals feel a sense of ownership over the Biennale. Even a tuk-tuk driver will tell you about artists he likes, the work he likes, and he'll tell you which artists were held to work with locally also. Yeah, they have choice words for some artists. So it's interesting why there's so much local engagement, and the reasons are multiple. One, it was started by artists from the local community. So artists are not seen as outside of society. Kerala, which is the state Kochi is in, is intensely proud of its literary, cultural heritage. I'm not from there at all. I'm from the north, from the Himalayas. So for me, it's like a foreign country, honestly. But I think that for me, when I brought Southeast Asian ideas into Kochi, they found resonance immediately, because actually the difference between South Asia and Southeast Asia is not as much as you would imagine. Yet when you look at the rhetoric that's in Singapore in online fora especially, it almost feels like there's an oppositionary kind of aggression, right? And this comes from a sense of being under siege, which is a whole other topic. But I think that this is what I mean by having to reevaluate your positions in a contextual way. So it's easier for me to actually present collaborative work between South and Southeast Asian practitioners in Kochi than it is to do here. I won't get into all the reasons why, but it's a pity that's the case, given that Singapore is way more supportive of the arts than the current Indian government is.
Something to think about.
Yeah, it's really something to think about.
Food for thought should be. Any quick responses before I just go to my next question? I just have one more question before we open to the floor. And Eugene, I see your questions in the Q&A, but if I could ask you to stand by, maybe speak up and maybe unpack some of the, I think the very rich ideas you have there. So you could pose a specific question to the panel, if I could probably to think about that. But the question I have for now is, from your different lenses, is there a wish list for cultural policy in Singapore as an artist curator, as an institution, as a cultural observer and academic? Is there something on your wish list? Yeah. Anyone can go first?
In some ways, I think, just picking on what Shubigi and Audrey have already said, I mean, one as a cultural institution is for funders to recognize that the work we do, it's over 10, 20, 30 years. We're not looking at the KPI for that 1 year. This year we have 10,000, next year you better have 20,000. So I think a better understanding, therefore, of the role of the arts or cultural institutions, some of the challenges that have been raised, that increasingly nations and people are feeling under siege, right? And that's why there's so much focus on citizenship rules. Even America, big and large, it's so contentious with its borders. And I think then what the role of the arts and cultural institutions like us in connection with cultural institutions worldwide is precisely to protect that space where citizens, people who are different can come together. They don't feel threatened. I mean, our job is to make sure that anyone who walks into a space, an artistic space or a cultural space, don't feel threatened, right? Always feel welcome, and yet still be confronted by something that may be different from him or her. And in that comfortable or safe space, confronted by something different, you realize it's not so scary. Or you may even discover you have a connection to it. So in some ways, the role of culture in having entrusted to be able to manage that difference. I think that's my other wish list. One, for longer timelines. Two, for recognition that actually it's not as if artists don't recognize that the world is chaotic, but that in certain spaces in the city or in artistic or cultural institutions, that they can be spaces where some of that chaos can exist, not blow up unnecessarily, or be managed in a way that we can help contextualize and we can create a safe space for people to bring down some of their, biases, etc., and then encounter those issues in you. I think in a very abstract sense, it will feel as if we're saying no censorship, long-term funding. But it's definitely more complex than that now. I don't think it's as simple as no censorship and long-term funding. But how do you approach long-term funding, and how do you think about still having regulation? I think every country or city has certain regulations. How then are those conversations about negotiating those regulations had with cultural platforms and institutions?
Thanks, Yvonne, for the nuance. Shubigi and Audrey.
Okay, maybe I will go. I completely support everything that Yvonne just said about time. So important to have a longer timeline. So in my research on impact of COVID on the arts, not released yet, but I can share with you some of the common response that of people we've interviewed is that the short timeline to turn around, for some of the grants that were given out during COVID, really just force people to just produce work because it's always tied to an output, right? So the longer time for gestation, for absorption, I think we need to think more in terms of say maybe outcome rather than output oriented. So that's my take on time. But wish list for cultural policy a lot. I think firstly, the question of cultural labor and the precarity of cultural labor I've talked about earlier. This is very, very important. Freelancers fell through the cracks. We know that, and the gig economy in Singapore, we always think, oh yeah, that's the Grab drivers, but it's not. 60% of the gig economy are arts and culture workers, right? The freelancers. And, in that group, more than 60 of them are young people under the age of 35. These are the young people of our country. We need to better protect them. We need to give them more, opportunities to nurture their profession. And so I think cultural policy needs to work with social policy. If we say the labor side, okay, is part of the kind of social policy umbrella, it needs to be a bit more integrated so that we can protect jobs, protect freelancers, respect the kind of work, and properly remunerate artists and freelancers, right? So that's one, and then the other one, I think. Wish list for cultural policy. Our Singapore is very good at churning out, cultural policy, and for the most part, very visionary, right? From the arts plan, before that, the Renaissance City Plan, before that, the creative economic development policy, all that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years that have, kind of resulted in the Esplanade, the whole, kind of civic district area. I think now, to maybe stand back a little bit, not just, think about cultural monuments or cultural infrastructure, but more to thinking about how to better support, as if Yvonne says, how to better support organizations, in moving forward, how to, kind of support them so that, if they want to be a little bit entrepreneurial, and if companies fail or don't do it that well, that's okay, right? So a lot more support, a lot more training, a lot more resources, towards the kind of innovative entrepreneurial mindset. I think that would be useful for policy to move forward. And of course, policy, I think, needs to, and we've done that, in terms of protecting diversity and protecting cultural rights, but to be a bit more daring so that we can actually really represent, equally all groups, so that, everyone feels like they are actually seen and heard and validated, right? Okay, that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Shubhi. Any quick words before I open to the floor? Yeah.
Thank you. I think most of my 10-minute holding forth was one gigantic wish list, wasn't it? I will, however, say that we should really look at what we get right, instead of constantly looking at what we get wrong and going through paroxysms of anxiety over that again. I think I'm glad Professor Audrey, you also brought up the idea of labor and the precarity. I did lead with that as well when I started speaking about the precarity. And I think what COVID did was only demonstrate these problems throw them into stark relief. These problems have always existed. I think that there's the creative, there's another poll, I think, and I think you all know about this as well. The highest levels of anxiety are amongst workers in the creative industries. And the least job security is in the creative industries, and the highest levels of, I hate to say this, but also when you look at the amount of work hours that are put in for remuneration, it's really paltry. So the idea that we wean arts practitioners off funding, government funding, is something that's being discussed for a while. I think my wish list would be, instead of trying to sort of strategize in this way, we should really look at why the situation exists in the first place, why did it get exacerbated during COVID is obvious, but the fact that there are systems in place that ensure that creative labor remains cheap, so that it is seen as a sustainable form of output. But actually sustainable, if something is cheap, it's because someone somewhere else paid the price. And very often, who paid the price? Unpaid people, volunteers, workers, interns. And you see this everywhere, not just in Singapore, but also at biennales and places like that. There's really an army of volunteers, young people who have the energy, who do everything. And they do it because they think this is how they get a foot in the door, so to speak, and they never really do. So I've seen the levels of burnout here, and also in other places across the world that I've worked in. My wish list would be that, as Professor Audrey also said, please let's not treat our young people in such a cavalier fashion. The level of disillusionment and burnout is very real. I think at the same time, let's look at what we get right. We have attempted to have arts enclaves. I think a great idea would be to extend that idea and have organically managed spaces. Instead of trying to manage artist spaces, let artists manage them themselves. Let it be and give it time. Right, Yvonne? I think that it's great if we allow people to make their own mistakes and learn from it. If we're constantly hand-holding throughout the process of setting up a community in a physical, tangible way, then what happens is that artists and other practitioners are unable to then create a genuine sense of, like, a genuine community space. All our community spaces are managed spaces, institutional spaces. We do not have spaces that we can speak of with any great conviction of spaces that have lasted, that have come from the ground up. Every time there is a communal space that comes from the ground up, it disappears after some time, either because the land is privatized or because it's not meeting a kind of, let's just say, the bottom line is always top. And my wish list would be, can we just not do that sometimes? I think if there are alternatives that are workable alternatives, they exist in the real world. This is not what people might say airy-fairy artist thinking. This is real. I work with this. I work with communities that have successfully done this. I've even worked with communities that have survived conflict, in fact, survived the longest siege in modern warfare, because they banded together as an arts community. And that's what helped them not only preserve their cultural identity and buildings and work and artifacts and so on, it also helped them survive as a people. And if you can survive war because of arts and culture, I don't think our challenges are as terrifying as they may seem. So really look at what we have already, try to find a way to support what we already have, instead of thinking we have to teach creative thinking. Look at the fact that it already exists, and find ways to have less intrusive forms of support. Give people time and space to breathe. All our time is managed and kind of compartmentalized and heavily mandated from the time we're small children here. Let's not do that so much anymore.
Thanks, Shubhi. Very passionate pitch and a good reminder. And I think your perspective is someone who has operated beyond Singapore. I think is of course of great value. I definitely agree that I think there more can be done, and certainly if you take a whole of Singapore approach and corporates and audiences and patrons, everybody steps up, then actually there's a lot more possibilities. I will leave it there. That's at least my 20 cents interjection. I will open to the floor, and I will invite Eugene to speak to help us help unpack some of the comments he has made and to pose a question to our panel. Eugene, are you there? Yes.
Yes, I am. Thank you very
Hi,
much.
hi, Eugene.
You hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. No, I wanted to start with a sort of counterpoint to Benedict Anderson, because Jean-Luc Nancy speaks about the multicultural as a melee, the melee that Yvonne speaks about in the Esplanade. And I just wondered, if we were talking identity as, and I'm fond of slash words, I'm sorry, one of which is you either slash id, entity, or identity. And I wondered how our panelists would like to take that, nuance on board, since Singapore is and has been many entities and acquired many identities. And if I understand Audrey from about 700 years ago, I mean, Cinderwood is well known by our flora and fauna specialists in Singapore. I think it's called Guharu. And it was exported to China. So, we were already an entrepreneur trade. We were already all of these things, and all of a sudden you have an institution that celebrates a bicentennial. And you wonder why. Of all the entities that you should pick 1965. Why not 1963? Why not 1959? Why not 1945? Or 1942? And so on and so forth. So I wondered where in this whole melee we would come to see a sense of common and uncommon.
Panelists? Audrey? Yeah.
Okay, I will attempt to respond, Eugene. Thanks for your question verbally, but all your chat comments also. I'm not going to go into all the theory you talk about. There's many problems to Anderson's work. One of which is, that's a very classic work, important work, right? But he never thought that the nation was porous. He always thought of the nation as closed and limited, right? So, and your counterpoint, the Jean-Luc Nancy's point, and let's you talk about, say, okay, common, okay, in common, or what was that, being in common. I think Anderson's idea of, common rituals or common shared beliefs, I think that one was quite static, right? And for a nation to be imagined, you really got to hold on in time to one set of ideas and then to say, okay, this is what we're going to show, just like in the bicentennial. But of course, we know that the lived notion of identity and community is always constantly configuring. So in your chat, you talk about having in common and being in common. I like the ing of those in common, right? Because the in common is about, it's a product of different groups coming together, being in common, having, in common, right? So that's the kind of like the, in my own work about this sort of ambient participation in festivals, I talk about these kinds of intercultural engagement, creating this kind of spirit, this feeling of conviviality, right? So conviviality means people coming together, enjoying the common space. And that is the product of different groups, different, identities all coming together at that point in time and what that's being created. And that for me is the politics of culture, right? So that's one way to understand, to respond to you about the counterpoint to Anderson. You like slash words, right? I don't like slash words. When my students write, dissertations with slash words, I deduct marks, right? It's just too unwieldy. But you're right.
I don't like it either, but there we are.
But you're right. Singapore has many identities, many entities, and
maybe it's acceptable in NIE. It's an NIE NUS thing. That kind of multiplicity and fluidity of identity has always been what Singapore has been. I think we should, continue to valorize that, not in a static way, but to know that it's always constantly changing, right? And bicentennial, why those particular milestones, I don't know. I think there are people in our audience who may have organized the bicentennial event at Fort Canning. We should ask them. But nonetheless, I think those important historical milestones, they are
key moments that are big moments, right? Big stories, big moments about the founding of the nation in all its manifestation. I think, we need to tell big stories so we can remember and celebrate. But more importantly, we need to tell small stories. We need to tell organic stories about the vernacular, about the subcultural, about the subnational, because all that is part of the lived, space and communities that also make up who we are as well. It's more a kind of reflective way of thinking about our identity. And finally, you talk about your written comment about Appadurai and artscapes, right? Of like 700 years of Singapore and traveling and all of that. I'm not going to go into the theoretical here, but if you read Appadurai, okay, despite all these scapes, including artscapes that we have all coined, he returns to that these scapes are caused by displacement, okay? When everything travels in a haphazard way, they come back together in a nation state to be re-territorialized. There is emplacement. So there's displacement from globalization, and then there is re-territorialization and emplacement, right? And in that place of emplacement, we can call it place or space, the one that we live in, that is the space of cultural imagination. That is his work, right? And I'm sure you've come across those quotes before. So okay, that's all I've got to.
Thanks, Audrey and Eugene. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to try and sneak in two more quick questions that came in the chat. One is from Carolyn and asking, what are some of the reasons of buy-in, the hesitation to buy in from the various communities. That's from Carolyn. I assume that means, why are some communities perhaps not taking to the arts and culture as a way of thinking about national identity? That's how I'm interpreting. And another question, the last question that came in is, how can we best assess or evaluate success in long-term outcomes in terms of arts, culture, heritage funding? I mean, that's a question that does pop up once in a while. I will invite any of the panelists to respond to any of these questions.
Perhaps one way is, this is to Carolyn's question. I think we sometimes, and I think Shubhi has also raised it, we box things in a lot. And so for many people, it's the arts mean, men in black and white suits playing the violin on stage. Therefore, it's not my kind of music. Oftentimes when you survey, you ask somebody, do you attend an arts event? They may say no, but then you can ask them, have you been to a concert? Then say, yeah, I went to a Jay Chou, or some pop concert. Jay Chou is not pop anymore. I went to a gig, but they do not see that as an arts event. I think we may, perhaps in the way we have our cultural policy and also the culture in Singapore, right? If you think historically, there was that colonial history. So we are also living and struggling with these various threads. But if you think people still dance at weddings, that's still part of our culture. Malay weddings have dance, So I think it's the way we have boxed the arts and culture in versus having a much more inclusive definition of that. Not everything funded is the arts. Not everything not funded is the arts, but we tend to have a funding kind of lens to it, very top-down lens to it.
Any of the other panelists have a view on these two questions? Should be please. Yeah.
Thank you. Just to extend from what Yvonne said, absolutely, I agree. I think that part of the problem comes from, again, like I said earlier, thinking the arts are separate from society and that artists exist outside of society. That's really not true. We are part of society, and everything we make contributes to that. So if we're asking questions like what role can the arts do to contribute to national identity or nation building, these are really the wrong questions. The act of making and thinking within a nation state already implies that you are involved in the making and creation, formation and continuation of that nation state, right? So just your sheer existence and your working is it is part of that process. So I think the moment the boxing begins when we phrase our questions, right? And these are very peculiar ways of phrasing, which I find are incredibly common across all government agencies here and institutions as well. Institutions that should be more creative in their ways of thinking. Perhaps what we should be asking is, why is there a perception that the arts exist outside society, right? Perhaps it should be something where, and I remember this also, which was a bit of a shock to me, that I won't mention who, somebody had visited one of the educational institutions, a senior figure actually had visited one of the educational institutions. And this is someone actually who was an important person in the art scene in Singapore and also important for growing it. And he said, people don't understand art. If you want to bring art to the heartlands, which is already a problematic idea, the idea of the heartlands, right? If you want to bring art to heartlands, you need to do face painting and henna. And this whole idea that something needs to be dumbed down implies that you think your audience cannot comprehend. And I cannot disagree more. Never assume your audience is a single-celled amoeba who don't understand anything, and they'll all react in exactly the same way. Let's just, when we talk about pluralism in the arts, pluralism in policy, we also should understand our audiences. Because of their pluralism, it is okay to not get all the eyeballs. Let's just, like Yvonne said, it's okay. And I think that anxiety of how come certain communities don't partake in certain things, I think that's also a matter of perception. I don't agree that that's actually the case. The numbers don't bear it out. And even if, just anecdotally, which is not something we should always rely on, of course, but even anecdotally, it's not wholly true. I think that if you look at how artistic production and artistic sort of expression occurs in a more organic way, also in a non-grant supported outcome way, then you'll also notice that it occurs a lot more often than like just look at the act of gardening, for instance, in community gardens, right? You see, I saw, for instance, at the Goodman Arts Center, there was a community garden there, but it was called the Relational Aesthetics Garden. Really? But when it's done in an HDB block, we want to mandate it and control it and so on. So these things already exist. Why is it that when an artist does it, what happens in an arts enclave, then it's given this veneer of, then we take it seriously. So the point I'm trying to make is that there isn't that much difference in separation. Let's just really look beyond that. Let's look at different forms of expression and thinking. And also, I think the idea of making a garden, for instance, comes back to our link to land. So when you talk about identity, I notice there's been very little discussion about link to land. And I don't mean land as in a territorial idea of land. I mean land as in a series of natural processes and entities. That is the natural world. So we have separated ourselves so much from the natural world that we're now unable to identify with anything other than obvious cultural markers. That is, I think, where the problem lies.
Thanks, Shubhiki. Yeah, I particularly appreciate how you're trying to challenge, some of us here in the way we frame some of these discussions. I think that's quite useful, and I think will resonate with many of us. Audrey, you want to have the last word and idea to questions? I thought the point about how to assess or evaluate success, would be good if you can touch on that.
Yeah, that's right. I thought, everybody was addressing the earlier question. I thought I respond to Jia Xian's question, right? What's the best, how best to assess or evaluate success in the long-term outcomes? There's no methodology to assess success, right? There are KPIs and people measure that, and I'm sure a lot of members of our audience are much better at doing that than I am. But I think in the long term, I like your use of the term long-term outcomes. I like what kind of outcomes do we want? Do we want to measure the public good of the arts, the cultural value of the arts? So cultural value of the arts, it means that arts produce intrinsic value that can only be generated by the arts, other relations can't, like we've talked about, sort of other relations, arts and health, well-being, arts and health, arts and, education and all of that, right? But, those things are quite instrumental in a way, right? But if you think like what is so unique about the arts that create cultural values that allow us to become better people, better humans, better citizens, if we can measure cultural value a little bit more in a long-term way, I think, we are, sort of going in the right direction towards developing a more robust set of methodology, right? But ultimately, I think if we think about, and here, this is the current program logic model, right? Who funds it and what's the outcome, right? So, and if you measure it in that context, then you're going to check a lot of boxes. But ultimately, right, who funds it? It's not just NAC or MCCY, right? It is really public, okay? So we need to think, how do we assess art as public good? How do we assess the public value of the arts? Those things are so much more important than checking boxes, right? So at the level of, say, citizen disposition, at the level of, place making, place identity, rootedness, and so on and so forth, right? I have no direct answers, but, these are some of the ways we can think through, towards developing a better methodology to assess all that.
Thanks, Audrey, for that. I'm afraid we've kind of run out of time. It's been such a rich discussion and with different points of views. I hope everyone in the audience agrees with me that this has been, really instructive in trying to, unpack some of the complicated ideas behind what does it mean to nurture a sense of us? What does it mean that, for the arts to have the arts, culture, and heritage to have a role, in the nation. I hope you will all thank me to join me in thanking our three panelists. I will invite them, each one to just quickly, 1 minute, just quickly sum up any final thoughts before I call it a day. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go in the same sequence that we had. So I'll start with Audrey and then Yvonne, and then should be just a quick one, okay? Less than 1 minute, preferably. Yeah, people are dropping off for lunch already.
All right, thanks, Paul. I'll be very quick. I don't have final words, but just to reiterate what I said about the importance and the foundation of the ACH sector to our future economy is really important because, there's a lot of focus on STEM, right? STEM, and a lot of focus on technology and digital this or that and quantum computing. We need to insert ACH into those discourses. We need to make ACH central to those kinds of future economy. And that way, it will give agency, it will give visibility, but more importantly, it will give autonomy for artists, organizations, and the sector as a whole.
Yes, thanks, Audrey. Yvonne.
At the end of the day, the arts is about being human. So ultimately, if you think of a nation and identity, it's a bunch of humans living together, wanting to feel comfortable, wanting to feel not out of place with one another. To me, it's kind of no-brainer that the arts is that space for things to happen. So, yeah.
Timeless reminder. Thank you. And Shubhigi, you have the last word.
Gosh,
Yes.
dislike that, and I dislike having only a minute to say things. Things become shallow then. Things become shallow, and that's actually my last word. Let's guard against shallow readings of things and knee-jerk reactions to things. I think there's a lot of great work already being done here, and I think it's okay to trust in processes being longer and outcomes being not obvious, tangible deliverables. I think it's okay also for us to relook at some of our phrasing and to relook at the fact that we think we have to constantly define who we are every time through the making and partaking of art and culture, but that's not what art and culture does. Art and culture is who we are and our existence, and the fact that we contemplate the nature of our existence. So I think that's something we should actually prioritize more than being so always trying to define in a very rigid way what it is that constitutes identity, singular, when it should be identity is actually a secondary consideration. Just the fact that we share this existence on this little blue-green rock together, let's just really not all the time find ways to say, okay, look, how are we in this small geographical area united by a similar arts or cultural output? That's really not something we should be chasing because it exists already.
Thanks. On that positive note, I will have to close today's session. A big thank you to Audrey Yue, Yvonne Tam, and Shubhigi Rao. I think it's been a lovely discussion. I've gotten a lot of notes written. And I ask everyone here still in the room to continue to support Culture Academy's many other activities. So on behalf of the Culture Academy, thank you and have a good day and stay supportive of the arts. I'll pass you back to Vaish for the final admin stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers and moderators once again for their inspiring discussions and sharing today. We've come to the end of today's In Conversation with webinar. Before you leave this session, we just have two announcements. Firstly, the Esplanade is hosting the upcoming APEC conference this October 2022. The Association of Asia Pacific Performing Arts Center is a network of prominent performing arts centers in the Asia Pacific region, related businesses in the arts and arts industry associations. Do look out for the conference details, which we will be sharing with you in mid-July. Secondly, we would appreciate if you could provide us with your feedback for today's webinar. You may access the feedback form via the link or scan the QR code that will be shown on the screen shortly. If you'd like to find out more about Culture Academy's programs, please visit www.cultureacademy.gov.sg, and you may check out our past webinars and resources that may be of interest to you. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar, which will be in August 2022. Till then, stay safe and healthy. Thank you.